This is Van Gogh Part 2. I know I was quite lengthy the first time around. I'm near finishing. I've got about 6 additional images to show you. So let's go directly to those images. We were looking at the Starry Night. I'll bring that up. I think I just said that we're looking here at um, a synthetic landscape, one that is constructed of various motifs that Van Gogh had observed um, or drawn on his memory to 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 include. Um, the general orientation of the mountains is one that he would have seen from his room in the asylum at Saint Remy, but there was no town visible in that view. That was on the other side of the asylum. So the town has been inserted, and the church that you see there is not one that is common to southern France. It seems to be a memory of his Dutch upbringing, tall, thin, steeple church. And then we have a cypress tree that's quite prominently placed in the left foreground. There were cypress trees around, not one in this particular view that he had from his window. But you'll notice that it is a natural motif that echoes, that forms a kind of counterpart, a formal counterpart to the church steeple in the distance. Both of them reaching from the ground up into the heavens. The church steeple just barely passing across the ridgeline of the mountains, so that heaven and earth are connected here. And overhead, we see a kind of celestial vision, the sky full of stars radiating light. Halley's Comet had been very recently seen in Europe, and so perhaps the comet-like form that is twisting across the middle of the painting is a reference to that phenomenon. There is additionally a crescent moon in the sky, one that radiates a lot of light. And I think I just had mentioned in the previous video that this is the motif that Van Gogh included in a number of paintings that have to do with wholeness and harmony and unity. In other cases, we see a male-female couple walking in the landscape beneath the crescent moon. Commentators have pondered the meaning of this painting in various ways, and often concluding that it's about death. Van Gogh had written that perhaps we take death to reach a star. And they've also attributed the pervasive blue color to melancholy. I would counter that by arguing that he's painting the night sky as if full of color and full of light, and blue is the most logical color to use for that, rather than something that would be wholly unnaturalistic, like pink or green. And the blue also functions as an effective contrast to the orangish stars, the golden stars. We have a near complementary contrast of the kind that Van Gogh often relied on to intensify his colors. So the painting seems full of motion, alive with energy, and I would label this not a depressing painting, but one that is a kind of exalted response to the beauty of the landscape, and particularly the night sky. And you recall that this is something that Van Gogh had commented in the past about seeing and responding to in an enthusiastic way. It awakened spiritual thoughts in him, and he had painted the night sky twice before, once in the Café Terrace at night, another in a work entitled The Starry Sky Over the Rhone. So this would seem to be the culminating, concluding vision, concluding realization of that motif. And in fact, he never again painted the night sky after this work. I want to show you one other work from Saint Remy that has a highly expressionistic um, flavor to it. This is called the Ravine. Here we see little in the way of complementary contrast, but rather a kind of overall sameness um, of analogous colors of about the same lightness and darkness. The main motif here is the riverbed that twists and turns through the middle of the painting. And that same twisting, contorted, implied movement one sees in the contours of the mountainsides with their steep slopes. They look precipitous. Um, the, um, there are bits of foliage clinging to the mountains. Altogether, it seems a painting that threatens the viewer with a dead end. This is a place where it would seem we could get lost and get kind of boxed in. It's easy to imagine this expressing Van Gogh's often troubled sentiments while residing in the asylum at Saint Remy. I've not mentioned Van Gogh's painting of I'm having the same trouble again. Let's stay here. I wanted to show you a self-portrait. I'm just going to skip that in order to finish up. In May of 1890, Van Gogh left the asylum. He had entered voluntarily. He was able to leave when he chose. He was pronounced cured by the supervising doctor. That seems a stretch based on little hard evidence. Perhaps he just simply not had a breakdown for a couple of months, although there was no predicting when that might occur again. An arrangement was made whereby he would reside, he would go back to Paris, but not stay there, simply visit his brother and go on to Auvers-sur-Oise, a town about 30 miles away, where Cézanne had lived, where Pissarro had lived, a small, peaceful village setting, farm fields around. There lived a doctor there by the name of Gachet, Paul Gachet, who was an amateur artist himself, a collector of Impressionist works, a supporter of those artists, and he agreed to watch over Vincent. And so that was the arrangement was made, and Vincent went there. He continued painting prolifically, about 75 paintings executed in the remaining 90 days of his life. And some of these are some of his, I think, most beautiful, most impressive works. And here's an example. This is the church at Auvers, which is a rather commonplace Romanesque building with a few Gothic features. I'm noticing Gothic tracery in the windows here, in the apse of the church. But Van Gogh transforms him into a radiant vision of fiery colors. The building set against the cobalt blue sky of the richest color. You can see it fades to almost near black at the very top of the image. The church is backlit, so light does fall on the roof, and the church casts a shadow toward us and then falls brilliantly on the ground, which is covered with patterned strokes, look like a bit like metal filings, cohering into linear patterns that suggest directions of movement. So this is that, I think we can relate this to that stippling technique that he got from Seurat and Signac, but used here in his own way. Whereas Seurat would impose a kind of uniform, ordered surface on the painting with his regular dots, Van Gogh's jabs of color always seem to be animated, to move, to lead the eye into the distant space, around forms, through forms. I show you this, which is entitled Daubigny's Garden. We're looking at the back of the church at Auvers, I should say the front of the church, the other side of the church from the last view. The entrance would be directly below here. And not far away was the former home of the now deceased artist Daubigny. This is the garden of that house. Daubigny's widow was still alive, and Van Gogh painted the subject a couple of different times. I want to emphasize about this the format. The painting is roughly a double square. You can see it's about twice as wide as it is tall. And this is a format that Van Gogh used quite frequently while painting in Auvers. We have a painting here that then focuses primarily on the flowers, the lush foliage, the reference to buildings in the distance, some complementary contrast, and the toned down though in the pink and the green, red against the green behind it. The same animated patterns of short jabbing strokes, and the rather whimsical motif of a cat painted much the same way, passing across the foreground of the image. Van Gogh did a few portraits at Auvers, and this is perhaps the most interesting. One of the two versions that he painted of Dr. Paul Gachet, the doctor and art enthusiast who had agreed to watch over him. Theo had observed, and Van Gogh, I think, noticed himself, that Gachet resembled Vincent a great deal. And so we might look at this as maybe subliminally a self-portrait to some degree. Van Gogh even identified with the nervousness of Gachet, the emotional anxiety that he betrayed in his behavior. He's shown him here with a melancholic expression on his face, and he's adapted, he's been given the conventional pose of melancholy in Western art for many centuries. That is a figure leaning on their hand and elbow and in a kind of passive state, just as Gachet is shown here. The color blue dominates the painting, but you'll notice that his face is orangish, and so we have a complementary contrast there. And in the foreground, the table, a brilliant red set against the green of a plant that Gachet holds. And this is a digitalis plant. Gachet had written a thesis on melancholy and was interested in heart disorders, and digitalis was used as a naturopathic medication for heart disorders. In this case, I think Van Gogh includes it with reference to not to stroke or to heart attack, that is a physical illness of the heart, but rather to a heartbreak, an emotional condition, which of course we see reflected in Gachet's melancholic expression. You'll notice that in addition to the complementary contrasts that are so strong here, all the lines, except for the single diagonal straight line of the table, all the other lines are curving, are snake-like, are active. That includes the contour of Gachet's jacket, the visible strokes that make up the jacket, and especially this undulating line in the background that is at the level of the eyes, so draws us attention to the eyes and defines a division between a darker and a lighter blue. And lastly, I'll show you this painting of roots and trunks, a painting in that double square format, twice as long as it is tall. And it's one of a number of paintings that that seem to move well away from naturalism into the realm of expressionism. It's hard to make out what's represented here. We seem to be perhaps on a bank or hillside looking down at tree trunks. You can see right here would be a place where the trunk meets the earth. And as these twisted trunks and branches rise up, then they um, they divide and form a kind of cage-like network that completely um, spans the width of the painting. Uh, it's hard to make any sense of the work. It seems to convey disorientation, entrapment, incarceration. And it's perhaps then, in this way, a key to Van Gogh's declining emotional state. Now, it's been traditionally thought that he committed suicide, that he shot himself, but a recent biography published about 10 years ago argues quite convincingly and brings together a lot of evidence to conclude that he was accidentally shot by a young man, a kind of reprobate teenager in the neighborhood, who, along with his brother, harassed Van Gogh from time to time and was known to have a gun that went off unpredictably. And so it's thought that the gun went off, perhaps the young man pointed at Van Gogh, the gun accidentally went off, and Van Gogh, feeling very negative about life and his prospects and the burden he placed on the finances of his brother, simply did not divulge the cause of the accident. The brothers, it's argued in this recent book, were whisked out of town quickly, so they could not be interviewed, and conclusions were rather quickly drawn that Van Gogh had committed suicide, although that explanation leaves a lot of questions unresolved. All right, so out of all this material about Van Gogh, I want to draw a few conclusions and remind you of a few main points to bear in mind. The first of those would be that his prolific output of painting, his relentless work and production, can be divided up into three periods. That first period spent in the Netherlands, largely a period of self-training, about 5 years long, from 1880 to 1886. The culmination of that period was his painting of the Potato Eaters. Before that, what he'd done was mostly studies, a lot of drawing, reading of textbooks, the absorbing of information and instruction where it was to be had. He then went to Paris, spent 2 years there, where he saw all the avant-garde developments, made some friendships, absorbed ideas from exhibitions and paintings that he saw, different styles, and then went to Provence in the south of France for about 2 years, 1 year in Arles, 1 year in the asylum, where his mature work is produced in great quantity, almost a painting a day. And there he's able, in the isolation, in the solitude of being in Provence, to forge his own mature style and to put it to use in the painting of primarily landscapes and portraits. His influences are many, and I would list these as realist painting, particularly that of Millet, and the images of peasants at work that he saw and loved in the art of Millet. And remember that late in life, he went back and made copies, his own very highly, richly colored copies of images that originated in the work of Millet. Another strong influence is Delacroix and Delacroix's expressive color. Another still would be Impressionist art, the broken brushstrokes, the strong colors of Impressionism, the idea of painting en plein air. And yet he said from Arles that as his mature style was developing, that he was drawing less and less on Impressionist examples, and that they might find fault with his work, and more on the expressive color of Delacroix. Another influence would be that of Japanese prints, particularly the bright color, the strong contours around individual forms, the flattened shapes that he saw in prints. We don't see so much the unusual points of view and perspectives that Gogh gleaned from Japanese prints. We don't see that so much in Van Gogh's art. Another influence would be contemporaries, the work of contemporaries such as Seurat and Gauguin. And yet, what Van Gogh saw and liked and learned from in their art, he tended to absorb and to make his own. And a clear example of that would be the pointillist technique of Seurat to become something quite different, the more agitated, patterned stippling that we see in Van Gogh's art. Beyond those artistic influences, he was strongly influenced by naturalist literature, literature of novelists like Zola, the Goncourts, Guy de Maupassant, and others. He read widely. And lastly, music. Now, interestingly, Van Gogh heard very little music, but there was a lot of talk about music in the critical discourse of the period. And he did, before leaving Paris, attend a few concerts of Wagner's music, not at the operas, but rather incidental music, say a prelude or an instrumental passage taken from the operas and played in a concert situation. Wagner was too controversial at that time in Paris for whole operas to be staged. And a single comment in a letter from Theo indicates that they had gone to some concerts and that they enjoyed the music very much. Particularly from the critical discourse about music, Van Gogh would have taken the idea that music was an abstract art, and that would have encouraged him in the direction of abstraction, of simplification, of exaggeration of things like color, line, and shape, and in the calculated balancing of colors that he sought in so many of his paintings. He said at one point that what he tried to achieve was a careful balance that was like Wagner's orchestra, as he said, which is big and full of many different instruments with their respective instrumental colors, but those colors were carefully combined to produce a result that was, in his, Van Gogh put it, intimate. We might describe his style then as expressive naturalism, but many works, I think, go beyond that. And naturalism in that he almost always sought to paint a model, paint a subject that was there in front of him. And yet the exaggeration, the simplification increases over his career, such that I think we could label his style incipient expressionism. An increasing number of artists and critics commented on his exhibited work in the last years of his life. Theo selected paintings and submitted them to the Salon of the Independents in 1889 and 1890, and a number of artists commented very enthusiastically about Van Gogh's art. He was also invited to exhibit with Les 20, the 20, that Belgian avant-garde group. And as you're going to read, Albert Aurier wrote a strongly enthusiastic article about Van Gogh. That was the only one about Van Gogh that was published during his lifetime. So I think he was about to become much more widely known, perhaps famous and celebrated during his lifetime. Had he lived maybe 5 years longer, he would of course have an influential impact on later artists, particularly those of the Fauve and Expressionist movements.